Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this webinar brought to you today by the Thomson Foundation and REVOLVE Circular. For the next hour or so, we'll be exploring the relationship between the media and the circular economy. Now, this is an official side event of the World Circular Economy Forum and Circular Week 2021. So many thanks to the organisers, the Government of Canada, as well as Citra and Innovo for having us. Hopefully, at the end of this, we'll understand a bit more about the challenges facing journalists when covering this incredibly complicated subject. What are they getting right? What are they getting wrong? And what role do journalists play in bringing this ambitious concept to life? And of course, we want to hear from you, our audience today, with your questions. We're also streaming this webinar live on Facebook via the Thomson Foundation page. Now, on your screens now, hopefully, you're going to see a quick poll. Because to everyone who has joined us, we're very interested to know a bit more about you, who you are. So it would be appreciated if you could take a few seconds to fill in this poll, telling us your professional background, please. While you're doing that, I shall just introduce myself. I'm Mackie, your moderator today. I'm a journalist and an editorial associate with the Thomson Foundation, an organisation which has spent the past 60 years helping to raise standards of journalism through training, consultancy and strategic advice. And our co-host today is REVOLVE Circular. REVOLVE Circular is a Vienna-based non-profit organisation with a focus on constructive journalism, science communication and promoting awareness and understanding about the circular economy. Well, looking at it, a lot of you, thank you for that, have actually had time to fill in the poll, so that will help us with our future research. So thanks very much for that. We can take the poll off the screen now because we're going to be introduced to our two panelists. I'm delighted that we're going to be able to be joined by them today, both of whom have a huge amount of experience grappling with this very tough subject. Sören Bauer is a communication strategist and president of REVOLVE Circular, which advocates for a systematic transformation from a linear culture obsessed with economic growth towards a just and inclusive circular society. And Sören tells me he prefers the slogan refuse, reduce and rethink over reuse, reduce and recycle. So we can get into that a bit more later on in this next hour or so. Benedict Wermter is an investigative freelance journalist from Germany. He specialises in circular economy stories, in particular plastics and waste disposal. He's currently working on a documentary for BBC World called The Recycling Lie. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just before we hear from both of you, we have actually got a very quick question for our audience. It's the crux of what we're talking about today, and it should be appearing hopefully on your screens now. The question is, what do you think when you hear the term circular economy? Do you think, great, another buzzword, that's something to do with recycling, right? I'm sensing a really interesting story opportunity. Do you think it's a necessary process towards greater resource efficiency, or do you think it's something else? Looking at some of the answers that are coming in, I think we've got a tenacious, well-informed audience. I'm glad to say. I'm aware there are people in the audience who will know a lot about this subject, but equally there will be people like me. I spent 30 years as a generalist reporter who are expected to become instant experts on any story that it's thrown at them. We'll get the result of that poll, but to be honest, looking at it, we've currently got 85% of people think this is a necessary process towards greater resource efficiency. In second place at 12% is great, another buzzword. There's some cynics out there, I fear. But Sören and Benedict, let's imagine just for a moment that you're doing a live TV report. You've been asked, what is the circular economy? Your editor says, you've got 60 seconds to explain it. Sören, let's start with you. What's the circular economy? And the stopwatch is on.
Okay, thanks, Cass, and hello, everyone. 60 seconds. Wow, actually did that in May, and I believe I came up with a not so great question with an answer which was far too theoretic and academic. So here's my little pitch. Circular economy is when a young farmer in Ivory Coast comes up with the idea of turning the skin of his pineapples into vegan leather, i.e. vegetable leather. Circular economy is also when the French government establishes what's called the repairability index, where French consumers actually learn about the level of repairability or non-repairability of electronic devices. France was the first country, or is the first country, to have established such an index in France. And for some of you who know these things, it really resonates with what's called the right to repair. Last one, circular economy is also when a young architect in Malawi builds a wonderful school with straw bales, using low-tech combined with extremely modern architecture and architectural knowledge and expertise, to use locally resourced materials to build such a school, which is beautiful for kids and built on local resources which are there. That is my little pitch, and I hope it illustrates what circular economy can be.
Thanks very much. The right to repair. So Benedict, it's your turn. How would you sum it up? What is the circular economy? And your 60 seconds starts now.
All right. Yeah, so thanks for having me. Circular economy, in my opinion, or as I understand it, is basically to keep resources in closed loops. Pretty simple. I feel like more like the 12% of you guys out there that consider it more like a buzzword. Meaning that I feel like we live in a linear economy, and everything I wear, I consume on a daily basis, which comes in plastic. My phone mostly ends up being dumped or burned. So this is the understanding that I have of the economy we live in. It seems linear. So circularity is then to keep this in a loop, and I hope we go towards this kind of economy one day. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much. So yeah, there's a lot of jargon, I think, around this. So the linear economy, just to explain, I buy something, I use it, I dump it. And you're saying that actually circular economy is about keeping all those things within the loop. We are going to hear a bit more from you both, but in the meantime, please send us your questions. This is an appeal to our audience now. I have got a moderator sitting next to me. I'll try and get through as many of your questions as I can, but please could you use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen rather than the chat panel? If you can't see the Q&A button, just hover your mouse over the top or bottom of your screen. Obviously, if you have an issue with that, please use the chat panel, but it's just a bit easier for us to see your questions. So Sören, let's get cracking then. If I can start with you first. I want to ask you really about the traction in general around the phrase circular economy. Clearly our audience today is aware about it, but if you Google phrases like climate change, like net zero, like recycling, literally tens of thousands of news stories come up. That's not the case with the circular economy. It doesn't seem to be referenced in stories to the same degree. You've done an audit, haven't you, of news stories in different languages. How much traction have you found this phrase circular economy is getting, and how is it being framed?
Okay, these are like almost 2 or 3 questions at the same time. I wouldn't call what I said an audit. I did a very rough and not necessarily scientifically sound kind of monitoring, what I call monitoring of media reporting. And you're right, obviously, circular economy as a term, when you look at trends in reporting, is obviously not as great as climate change. Actually, I haven't compared it. One of the things I will say is about its relationship with the Sustainable Development Goals. I believe that even if you were to start monitoring media reporting on Sustainable Development Goals, you will not find that much. So having said that, another thing I will say is that journalists out there probably they do write many stories related to what we call a circular economy, i.e. stories related to repairing, recycling, repurposing, remanufacturing, any of these so-called circular economy action imperatives, but they don't necessarily call this a circular economy story when they write about it. And that's maybe one of the reasons why we don't find it as a term in in journalistic reporting that much.
You've got a breakdown, haven't you? Maybe you can quickly show us of the sort of things
Yes.
you found.
Okay, I do now get my 5 minutes to present my little thing. Okay, good. I will share my screen and wait for everyone to tell me, or someone to tell me that I'm actually sharing. Is it on?
We can see it, and you're in presentation mode, so take it away.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, good. As you can see, I claim to have done this for almost a year. I started in November last year. We're not using meltwater or anything more sophisticated than that, because I'm doing this for roughly an hour per day, using Google Alerts in English, French, Spanish, and German since November 2020, and I speed read on a daily basis 15 to 20 articles, so 100 articles per week, 400 articles roughly per month, which is round about 4,000 to 5,000 articles I have speed read in the last year. Here are the search terms I've used, which shows you that any article not mentioning those terms will actually not appear in my search. So I only looked at articles which specifically used the phrases or the term circular economy, and those which you see there in any of those 4 languages. But I've done some media monitoring, and I commissioned some media monitoring before in my former life. So I know what media monitoring is, but I have not used a specific methodology. It's not a sentiment analysis, and I'm not claiming for this to be a representative sample. Now, what have I found? There are many, as I said, there are many stories about or related to circular economy, which obviously do not mention the term. So I have not searched or analyzed these stories in any way whatsoever, because I have not found them. I just read them by accident. Key takeaway or key observation number 1 is the narrative on the circular economy in the media is dominated by stories about waste management, or frames, if you will, by framing circular economy stories as waste management and recycling. Another one is that because journalists are storytellers, they obviously need to find an angle, a certain industry or a certain product as an entry point to a given circular economy story. So you find a lot of stories about one specific product or industry. Now, following up on waste management and recycling, I have seen and read a lot of stories about plastic, fashion, packaging, food waste, and those other terms which you see there, and also in recent times increasingly on the link between circular economy and climate or climate change. Having said that, at the downside, there are very few stories who take a more holistic and larger societal look, where you look into legal frameworks or questions of transformation from linear to circular. Now, a few topics are clearly, from my point of view, underrepresented, and I believe that there are opportunities for journalists to actually start working on these. And these findings are actually, for myself, one of the reasons why I think we should have such a webinar today, because I believe that there's a lot of good story ideas for journalists in what we call a circular economy, but journalists need to be capacitated to actually learn about these things. I will not go into all of the 10 here. I just want to point out, let's say, number 1, flaws of the linear economy and circular economy barriers. I have not read many stories where you could tell that journalists are very aware about the current legal system almost globally dominating the way we deal with resources. Obviously, waste in one country is not the same as waste in other countries, and there are big varieties in between countries. However, there are few stories looking into what's wrong with the linear economy or what might be wrong. Next example, number 5, extended producer responsibility. That's a term which we use when we talk about circular economy. If you are a journalist and you don't know what this actually means, obviously it's difficult to write a story about this and to look at why is it that producers are also only responsible up until the point of sale of their respective product, and not anymore when this product has been sold, when it becomes somehow the responsibility of the consumer or the taxpayer or the country. A third one, maybe the last one, built environment and construction. I've not really highlighted it, but I believe there's a huge opportunity for journalists to look into circular design of buildings, circular architecture. These are great stories that could be told, and I have not seen so many. Yeah, and I would be through. I think my 5 minutes are up.
Thank you very much for that. A lot of work. I wonder though, if people can't even agree on what it actually means, is it really any surprise that it isn't getting a lot of traction in newsrooms? And how can we change that?
I tend to I mean, you're asking a question. My feeling is that, or what I personally like about the circular economy is that it's an umbrella term which englobes so many different
Sören, sorry to interrupt, but could you stop sharing your screen if that's okay?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Sorry, I forgot to do so. Yeah. So I was saying that for me, one of the advantages of what we call a circular economy, even so there's disagreement or there's lack of agreement of what exactly it is, and there are different kinds of discourses about circularity, is an opportunity, because you can tell so many different stories and relate them, but maybe, as I said, relate them more to what is wrong with the linear economy, what is wrong with the take, make, waste economy, take, make, waste, lose, I should say, economy, which we live in, and what are the alternatives out there. I believe that if journalists from different beats become more aware that, I would say, the world is in trouble, we have all kinds of resource constraints with various kinds of natural resources, and you then invest into what are the alternative economic models, there's no way you will not find out a little bit about sharing economy, circular economy, blue economy, or bio-based economy. So my point is rather about
so every beat in the newsroom basically should cover.
Not necessarily. What I have not said is that you typically have people on the environmental beat writing about circular economy, because it's about resources, it's about natural resources. But you have very few, or I have not seen many, legal stories about this, where journalists research and investigate and look into, isn't there something wrong with our legislation, whether it's in Europe or other places, and why can certain things not be done, and why is the European Union actually partly thinking about changing certain laws, and why in this case is France already changing certain laws, because in a certain sense the throwaway society is not acceptable anymore.
It's a problem though, isn't it, for newsrooms, because newsrooms around the world are struggling with resources. There's job cuts across the board. You don't have as much time to research topics. This is a subject where you need to do some research. I just wonder what the solution is to that. What would you like to see happen? More training?
It's a tricky one. I mean, who am I? The last time I was in a newsroom is 25 years ago. I'm now back to working as a journalism a little bit, but just part-time. Yes, I do believe that because circular economy thinking, or what's called circular policies and practices, can have an influence and is relevant for society, the way we drive or we run the global economy, how we deal with natural resources, is a worthwhile investment. Now, you're rightly saying that resources are in newsrooms, in media outlets, are obviously very constrained. We know that. I would call for training of journalists, very condensed kind of speed training, to expose journalists to, the basics of the circular economy, and also to the basics of what is wrong with the linear economy and why should we or should they report on these things.
Just before I bring in Benedict, I've just got one last question. I want to ask you about whether or not it's a hard sell for journalists, certainly in some parts of the world. You know, the amount of coverage and the way it's covered, is it country dependent? You know, by that I mean people living in Northern Europe, say, are very keen to display their green essentials. How are journalists expected to cover this subject if their audience, for example, are textile workers in Bangladesh who rely on consumers to continue buying the product so they get a salary? You know, it's a very hard sell. And does it depend on where you're living and where you're delivering that news?
Yes and no. First of all, from what I know, and I've done a bit of research of this, I wrote a thesis about circular economy and SDGs. Circular economy priorities in different parts of the world cannot be the same thing. There needs to be different kinds of priorities. Now, having said that, we did a media seminar, a webinar in April, and we had a great coverage from a Nigerian journalist who did a story about the absence of regulations of electronic waste and what it means for the Nigerian economy and for Nigerians working on electronic waste. You would not have such a story in a European context because electronic waste is regulated here, which doesn't mean that there cannot be all kinds of e-waste stories, because as European consumers, we consume far too much of electronic devices and export them to far away countries to export what we want to get rid of. So, I mean, I would say there is enough food for thought and enough story potential for different angles, whether, as I said, whatever industry you are looking at and whatever country you are in.
Thank you for that. Hopefully our audience, wherever you are in the world, can pick up on that and will send us some more of your questions. Thank you for the questions we've had so far. And thank you to Benedict for sitting there very patiently. It is a complicated subject, Benedict. I think we can all agree on that. You've investigated, haven't you, and written a number of stories on this topic. Can you just give us a quick example, really, of a story that you've covered?
Yeah, so I had an entry point to the circular economy with PET bottles, formerly known as plastic bottles. And I wanted to present that because it is something that is actually truly recyclable and sometimes really going in closed loops. But on the other hand, we also see that industries use it as at the same time as a greenwash tool to say that these bottles are like bottle-to-bottle recycled or 100% recycled material. First of all, we have to see that on a worldwide scale, PET bottles mostly are not collected by any waste management, but they are landfilled or even worse, littered. And then if we look into Western countries where there is separate collection, we see that PET bottles are then collected and then they are sorted, then they are shredded and washed. And after that, they are turned into something called PET flakes. And from that, you can make eventually a new bottle. So there is some potential for circular economy. And what I did then is I investigated it. I had a source and he was drawing my attention to microplastics out of recycling processes. So I was looking into this and then I found out, okay, this recycling process emits microplastic, which then ends up in nature. I never heard about that before. So it is some sort of risk, which is obviously, yeah, nobody took into account for life cycle assessment or anything. Also, you can only recycle such a bottle for some certain time. So at some point, the material loses quality and you cannot recycle it anymore. And third, it is not bottle to bottle, but it has to be actually called bottle to backpack or bottle to jogging shirt, because most plastic bottles are then, the flakes are then bought by other industries. So you see the reality of this circularity is fairly different than the industries try to make us believe.
I just want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier on. You used the word greenwash. That's sort of another bit of terminology that's floating around every time we mention circular economy. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, greenwashing is then when industries claim that they are sustainable, but they're actually not. Meaning that look back to the PET bottles or plastic bottles, it says that they are made out of 100% recycled plastic. You don't know if it's true. I mean, they could also take material that is from the industrial process and then call it a recycled material. And we're talking about the gold of plastics. So we don't talk about the vast majority that we consume every day and that we investigate in this documentary that I'm co-directing, when plastics end up somewhere around the globe being dumped or burned, or yeah, there's a whole network of criminals behind it. So yeah, industries is trying to make us believe that this is really recyclable and recycled content, and then this should be greenwashed.
I mean, if we go back to what we were talking with Sören about the pressure on newsrooms now and journalists to cover so many different stories that they're not experts on, how vulnerable do you think journalists are to the sort of PR spin that goes around the circular economy? And as you say, businesses claiming to be doing something which is actually quite far removed from reality.
That's the crucial point. I mean, I know the life in newsrooms, you don't have time. You eventually become like a papagay, or like you have to repeat this sort of marketing lies that you read in annual reports or whatsoever, where the greenwash happens. So yeah, we are as journalists very vulnerable for this if you don't have time to investigate. I mean, if you have sources and if you have your network and if you can get to the bottom of it, then there is a chance that you understand the cost structure, that you understand statistics, and then you understand if someone tells you that they prevent 1 billion bottles of entering the markets, and then you have to ask, okay, are you talking about small or big bottles, right? So this is something you need time to investigate. Can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. You should be able to hear me now. I'm just curious to know, Benedict, when you are pitching a story, again, going back to what we are talking about it possibly being a hard sell in newsrooms, do you use the term circular economy when you're pitching these stories? And what sort of reaction do you get from commissioning editors?
I mostly don't use the term because I'm not convinced by the term in a way that it addresses so many different things, and it's such an inconsistent term. I mean, the term circular economy is just a label, you know. I mean, it was called like gig economy or knowledgeable economy before, and maybe we even see new terms like I don't know what in the future. So I usually try to avoid these terms. I mean, it is a natural sense that you try to keep resources in a loop. So I think we don't need to actually label them. So to answer your question, I usually just try to pitch a story very accurate. And in my opinion, the biggest problem is that for many cases, you don't have a strong storyteller inside your story, like a strong protagonist. It is sometimes abstract and hard to understand. Editors usually also don't have much time or sometimes misunderstand the topic. So this is things that I mostly worry about when I think I have a good story and I know that the actual interest is sometimes pretty low.
Just one last question before we go to some of the questions from the audience. Is it important, do you think, that when you have a story that then involves the circular economy, much like any environmental story, you get your local story, but you broaden it out, you make it global because this is part of a global issue? And I know you did that, didn't you, in your plastic story? You started off with a local story in Germany and you zoomed out to look at the global picture. Is that something that journalists should be thinking of when they're writing these stories?
Definitely. I mean, we're all sitting in the same boat now with different cabins. I mean, okay, Corona is nowadays bringing things in disorder, obviously, but still, yeah, of course, you need to understand that on global scale. So what we did for this documentary is we follow the waste stream of consumer plastic waste, and then and we're talking about the richest countries in the world, where you can basically just use half of the waste, and then the other half needs to be burned or eventually then gets exported to countries that don't even have a separate collection, and they then should recycle it for us. You know the stories, it ends up in Malaysia, Indonesia before. And for this documentary, we go into Eastern European countries, into Turkey. Yeah, so in order to get a full sense of the picture, you need to look at global scale. I hope I answered your question.
You did. Thank you very much. Right, we've got a lot of questions, I'm glad to say, from our audience. I'm going to start off with this one from Simona Gabalcona. Simona says, I work in a digital marketplace which focuses on helping companies trade their waste and in so doing slowly switch to a circular economy and waste management. How would you recommend such green tech startups approach the media? How should we make sure our results and aims are interesting for journalists? Talking as someone who used to be a news editor, I know my first question to journalists was always, what are the pictures? What are we going to see? And why does the audience care? I wondered if either of you have got any advice to Simona of how they can make their green startup, how should they approach the media? Who should we start with? Sören, should we start with you? What would you suggest?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts about that. Well, first of all, I would always say pre-cook your story for media. Make it easy for journalists to do their work. Don't expect journalists. I mean, journalists are busy people. They don't have much time, and give them what they need to convince their editor-in-chief that this is actually a story. So you pre-cook your own story, the more likely it is that it will be picked up. Now, what is your story? I don't think that your story is necessarily, the story is about the issue you're trying to address with your company and technology. It's about waste management. It's probably about a waste hierarchy and enabling a waste hierarchy. It's also about waste as a resource. So there are different stories in there, but I would definitely use the bigger picture of why are you doing this? What's the bigger problem you're trying to address? And where are you currently? How do you resolve these issues? And what are you planning to do in the future? This, I believe, could be an interesting story.
Thanks for that, Sören. Benedict, how would you make, you obviously have to make these stories interesting for an audience. What would you recommend this green tech startup should be thinking about when trying to sell its stories pretty much to the press?
You mean like how a green startup should present themselves?
Yeah, how should they present themselves so you think that's a good story, I'll come and do that?
Well, I mostly come across them and then I wonder, like, is this what they're doing? Is this scalable? And is this really, is it really circular or not? I mean, in order to draw my attention, or like in order to convince me, you should definitely be as transparent as possible, and don't exaggerate on your business model. And yeah, these are basically the two things. I mean, I see a lot of these startups, or like, I don't know, ocean cleanups whatsoever. And I think like, okay, nice idea, nice to have. You can make a backpack out of ocean waste. So how many backpacks can you make out of ocean waste, right? So if you probably one of the CEOs of these companies, then yeah, you better be prepared to have a really scalable model. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, hopefully, Simona, that's answered some of your questions at least. We've got another question here from Sarah Vendorm. If you argue that journalists cover the flaws of the linear economy, do you feel that journalists should also be covering the flaws of the circular economy? Or should we just be happy that finally something is happening to challenge our economic framework? Sören, I think this is probably one for you, considering your findings.
Well, a big yes, absolutely. I mean, Benedict is already doing this. For me, the biggest flaw of the circular economy is rebound effects, or what's historically called Jevons paradox. I would invite everyone to look this up because these are beautiful stories, and these are stories that need to be told, which make people understand, or help journalists, first of all, to understand that a circular economy, whatever exactly it is not a silver bullet for resolving all these problems. There may be rebound effects. The way it is presented may often result in such rebound effects, i.e., you can have a pretty nice circular economy approach or circular business model, but you're actually not resolving anything. What you're doing is counterproductive. And as much as we would like to enable journalists to better understand the key barriers established by decades of a linear economy, which are barriers towards more circularity, I would also want to help journalists understand and teach them about the key issues around the circular economy, including what Benedict already referred to, i.e., or what you asked, i.e. greenwashing, because one of my observations is that we can almost start talking about circular washing or circularity washing, where using circular economy terminology is kind of a sub-form of greenwashing, and that definitely needs to be investigated by journalists.
Just to pick up on that and Sarah's point, there was a report earlier this month by the University of Lancaster Business School, the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. The headline was "Circular Economy is Unclear and Lacks Substance." This kind of goes to Sarah's point, really. You know, they say there are questions we need to ask. One being, how do we know that a circular solution is good for the environment? I mean, Benedict, as somebody who's asking questions probably like this all the time, do you think that's a fair assessment, a fair question?
Like what they say in the study, or
well, so Sarah's point that should we just cover the flaws of the circular economy much like we cover the linear economy? We should just maybe accept what we're being told by companies.
Yeah, I mean, basically that's what I did with these plastic bottles. It is an example for something that is really going circular, but then in the end you see that there is a flaw in it. But I mean, we have to be open about it, that like the study you just mentioned, and basically there is no such things like really a circular economy. So I mean, everything that we really should focus on is like what is claimed as circular, and then in reality it is still linear. So yeah, I think that's what we should do.
I guess what you're saying is just question everything you're being told, and as much as you can research it. We've got a question here from an anonymous attendee. It goes back really to one of the questions I asked you, Sören, about whether or not it depends where you live in the world as to how you might cover this topic. The question is, the circular economy is little known in lower to middle income countries, which is why our reporting tends to focus on more accepted and understood terminology such as recycling and waste management. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on how to bridge this gap in knowledge? Sören, I mean, it's a tough one, this. Do you have any suggestions?
Actually, it's not that tough, because I kept thinking about this since a week. So a week ago, I was in Lagos, Nigeria, and I attended the official launch of the circular business platform Lagos, and great event. But what I realized is that is exactly this. What people are talking about when they refer to a circular Lagos or a circular economy in any given city is mainly about recycling and waste management, which is about end-of-life treatment or management of products. Which is a misperception, total misperception. That is why I believe that we need to educate journalists, policymakers, consumers, and others about what we mean if we say circular economy, because we refer to product design. We refer to how do you even avoid waste. There's a great organization in Nairobi which does programs about designing out waste, and they work with product designers. Now, to answer the question, I believe that it is totally obvious and normal that in certain world regions, journalists will write about and cover what the respective priority in this country or region is. And if the priority is lack of waste management and the need to recycle, they need to cover those things. Having said that, it will be also good to educate journalists to take a critical look, because here we come to greenwashing or circularity washing, because even in those world regions, corporations and governments start to use the circular economy terminology while using it in this very limited and very reduced meaning, i.e. recycling and waste management. And again, that's not what it is about. So if you're a journalist covering these topics, you may want to ask questions like, okay, how can this 20 million city avoid waste? Why do we even have so many plastic bottles? Why do we demolish all these buildings and not keep them and refurbish them? You can only ask those questions, I believe, if you have more exposure to more sophisticated circular economy thinking to become aware what's actually doable and what the term really means.
On a practical level, Benedict, going back to something you said earlier, for journalists, particularly if they're not environmental journalists, how useful is it to have like a team of experts in your back pocket, people you've researched, people you know and trust that you can ring up and say, I've got a story here, what does it mean? Is that something you do? Yes, absolutely. This is basically when I started to investigate in this, I listened to like circular economy experts. They even call it like that in German, Kreislaufwirtschaftsexperten and stuff like that. They might be activists, sometimes scientists. And yeah, I agree, like what Sören, what you say, these people then they can tell you that it's not only about recycling or waste management, but it starts at the very beginning. If you want to keep things circular, you have to keep loops small, you have to avoid, you have to reduce, refill, deposit, whatever. There are like plenty of ideas and things that need to be adapted in the future. And to answer your question, Kath, yeah, you need this sort of experts. And from there, it makes things much more easy. Great, thank you both for that. We've got another question now from Laxmi Hay. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. I'm a journalist working as editorial lead as a circular economy think tank. We have editorial capacity, but don't always find huge interest from publications for our stories. But we really want to get our stories about the circular economy out there. Is there an appetite? This goes straight back to something we've already discussed, isn't it? It's a hard sell. When you go around newsrooms, talk to editors, talk to other journalists, Benedict, is there an appetite for this story, or do people just roll their eyes and go? Yeah, they're all rolling their eyes. No, to be honest, in the last years, I had to get some sort of journalistic funds in order to investigate, yeah, I mean, I think we should draw this. It's not about circular economy. I think it should be actually about climate change and climate reporting in the future. So if you want to get appetite in newsrooms, and once this corona thingy is over, hopefully, or at least under control, then I think climate reporting and climate change will be much more in focus. And then circular economy, or whatever you call it, keeping these resources in a loop and trying to get our footprints under control will be in focus again. And I think this is then where there is a chance to get newsrooms more involved and interested in this. Yes, thank you for that. Well, I mean, Sören, what do you think? As somebody who's been grappling with this subject, is there much of an appetite out there for it, do you think?
Well, straightforward answer, no, not yet. But maybe it's also the ball is in our court as journalists or content producers. And I know that Lashmi is facing the same challenge as we do. I started producing a kind of a special on circular economy in our quarterly magazine. And I can tell from the numbers or the downloads that not so many people are reading it. Even so, I'm doing my best to make it interesting to read. So I actually have a little, I don't know, I have an idea, and I think we will be launching it next year. So I can already officially announce it here. I didn't know I was going to do that, but it's part of the answer I will give you. The solution I have found, I don't know if it's the right solution, but we're going to launch what we call circular economy journalism on demand. So we are simply going to go out there with currently 15 to 20 topics, which are somewhat related to the circular economy. And we will do a poll, and we will simply ask our readers or people around the world, which of those 15 topics would you like us to investigate? It can be circular economy in a certain country, in a world region, in a certain industry, about a certain kind of resource. I would love to do a story about sand, for example, but I'm trying to switch it around by not having me decide what we should cover in our quarterly, but having our readers or potentially interested readers decide. And we would then pick up whatever kind of topic is the highest ranking, and write a few articles and conduct a few interviews about it. That's the intermediate solution I have come up with. I don't know if it will work, but we will give ourselves a year to try this.
So you mentioned the word solution there. So if I take a bit of a right turn here, we've got a question about solutions journalism, which is an important part of how we cover this story. It's from Hugo Werner. One of the problems is that the circular economy is trying to change an economic model that's set in over the course of a century and a half in industrialized countries with consumption-driven economies. Is part of the solution starting to paint a picture of what the circular economy looks like? I mean, is that the problem? Is the problem the fact that the circular economy for many people is just theoretical? It's not actual. We need to start showing people what it actually looks like in practice. And is that part of the solution, do you think? Who wants to, Benedict, I saw you.
Yeah, just briefly, I feel like, again, we talk about this linear streams or a linear economy that is then labeled circular. I mean, I recently saw that even some experts in Germany would consider incineration as an integral or a very important part of the circular economy. And then I'm just thinking, yeah, I mean, and this comes from experts and legislation, and like, yeah, I mean, again, we live in a linear world, and that is sometimes labeled circular, and it's all about like telling the truth about this situation.
So Sören, what do you think about this? I mean, how can we show people what a circular economy looks like? Because again, going back to me being that awful news editor, what are the pictures? What are the pictures?
Well, really, by the way, pictures, i.e. visualizing circularity, is very difficult. I mean, you search for pictures, you end up with all kinds of recycling and waste images. That's what you have. How do you visualize circular design? How do you visualize a circular business model? I mean, that's maybe one of the problems we face in terms of trying to tell a circular narrative or circular story, because we don't necessarily have, or not yet, strong images which illustrate and which convey what we're talking about. That's clearly a challenge. The other part of the answer to Hugo's question, which I would come up with, is yes, there are a lot of solutions in circular policies and practices, and I read many stories about such solutions, but apparently this is not sufficient in terms of convincing editors-in-chief or convincing readers. These stories are kind of they're too good to be true sometimes. We're kind of dreaming up this great circular future because we know already how to do these things, while at the same time recognizing as the annual circularity gap reports are telling us, that the world is more than 90% linear and less than 10% circular. So what I would say is that all those working on circular stories or circular economy stories, whether you work in an advocacy organization or you are just a journalist and you feel like this is a good thing to cover, I feel like we should much more focus on what's wrong with the linear economy. Make it dramatic, make it urgent, show the flaws of linear economy. How did we even end up in such a situation? How have certain things become acceptable? Because that's a far more interesting angle, where you then can build up by saying, by the way, there's something called whatever, repair, repurpose, something, which seems to provide a solution. But that might be in conflict with what we call constructive or solution journalism. But to be honest, I believe that constructive or solution journalism might just be a little bit too naive or too good to be true, because we're not showing the real problems which we inherited and we keep inheriting from linear economy.
I wonder though if the problem with, if we keep pointing out the problems with linear economy, that journalists always has to be aware of their audience. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that millions of people are reliant on the linear economy for their jobs. And we've got a question to that point really from Muli Venkatesan. Apologies, Muli, if I've pronounced your surname incorrectly. It's about the Western nations imposing views on emerging economies. The question is, do you feel the Western industrialized nations are just coining new terms and imposing it to all other countries, irrespective of the fact that honestly, it doesn't do anything better? So does the circular economy do anything better than the system we have now, I guess is the question. And is it rich nations telling poorer nations how they should be facing the future?
I would just like to say to that question that I think everybody understands, or everybody can imagine, maybe even intuitively, how circularity works. I mean, reducing or repairing is nothing that abstract. It is about the cost structure. I mean, we will still live in a linear world as long as it is cheaper to buy a new iPhone than to repair your iPhone. And there is some sort of circular economy about that in maybe Nigeria, where Sören has been, or in Asian countries where I like to be, because there it's sometimes cheaper, but still most of the time it is for people or even for industries, it is cheaper to use virgin material. And as long as you live in this system, still things end up as rubbish.
Sören, what do you think of Muli's question? Is it industrializations just coining new terms and imposing them on the rest of the world?
No, I wouldn't say so. That would be too radical for me, because I mean, if you look at Africa, where I investigated more, you know, there's already something called the African Circular Economy Alliance, which is 5 African governments having come together to actually conduct market research and look at the potential for certain industries on the continent to go circular. And they own this process, obviously. So I wouldn't say that this is something which is imposed. I would just say that any country, any responsible policymaker should not, may be inspired by how other far away or not so far away countries or industries go about going circular. But each country is different, each economy is different. You really need to look at your kind of industrial base. If you're a country which is predominantly agricultural, you will need to look into regenerative agriculture. I would still say that circular economy thinking and doing can help you identify certain things which you may have been doing for a long time. There's a lot of repairing and remanufacturing and repurposing in emerging economies anyway. Here the question might be, how do you actually take this? How do you capacitate millions of people working in the informal sector, where they repair a lot anyway, and you formalize those sectors, and you create the capacity of those people to do these things better. And by the way, you create a lot of jobs, which is also needed. So clearly, circular economy thinking, I believe, if you adapt it in the right manner, can provide solutions also for job creation in certain world regions.
I wondered if we could just have a quick word around the language. We've touched on this already, about the language used around the circular economy, because we've had a couple of questions on a similar vein, really, about the jargon. You know, are linear and circular economy jargon words? And circular economy, somebody's saying it seems to have acquired a bad name because it's being linked to greenwashing. And also, of course, circular economy doesn't mention things like environment or climate change within it. Do we maybe need to think about rephrasing and the type of language we're using around circular economy, so it's more accessible to an audience, I guess, is what I'm trying to say? Benedict, as somebody who's writing stories.
Why do you need to, if it's happening anyways, why do you need to label it as a circular economy then, right? If a package is recyclable, I mean, that should be the standard, right? Then actually, why does a company needs to print it on their package and then say, yeah, this is part of the circular economy? I mean, this should be modus operandi, this should be the standard, and then you don't need to use any of these terms at all. And to go back at the question before, yeah, in this case, I agree it would be a bit of an imposing and then to other countries and to, yeah, as an excuse to probably just produce more virgin material.
So, Sören, are you happy to stick with the phrase circular economy, or can you see it changing anytime soon?
No, that will not change. You know, one of the things I have a different opinion than Benedict, but I also come from a different background. One of the things I like about this term is because it's an umbrella term, everyone uses it for their respective purposes, and we certainly do not agree what we mean. So, you know, the circular economy by the Norwegian government or Accenture Strategy or other organizations out there might not be my circular economy. Still, they are using the same terminology as I do. Now, I believe that that is actually part of the success story of what we call a circular economy, because everyone uses the same terminology by saying different things. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't really know, but I have a feeling that you have all kinds of people and organizations who maybe the bottom line is that they all agree that there's something wrong with this thing which we call a linear economy. And they all agree that that there's necessity to change. Now, how radically they go about this kind of change in their respective industry in different markets is a different thing. But what might unite those organizations, also journalists and others who write about circular economy, is a strong feeling about something is wrong with the way we are running the economy, and there seems to be something in this circular economy, but also blue economy, sharing economy, bio-based economy, and other such economies, which provide an alternative, and we need to look closer at those things because we can't possibly continue the way we have been doing these things for the last decades.
Sören, Benedict, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you very much to the audience, all of you out there who've sent us your questions. It's been a really interesting debate. Hopefully we all know something a bit more now about the circular economy. Before you all disappear, and I am talking to the audience now, we've got one last poll for you. Hopefully it will pop up on your screens anytime soon. We'd like to know what more we can do to help you cover the circular economy. And I did notice as we were going through, there were a few questions popping up about where can I get help? You know, are there workshops, are there training out there? So please fill this in. What offers would you like to see? A set of reporting principles, a workshop series for journalists interested in working on the circular economy, a global network of journalists knowledgeable about the circular economy, or something else. So hopefully we'll take that away and something will come of it for you. Also, after this webinar, you'll receive an email with a short survey, and we'd be really grateful actually if you could spare a few moments to fill it in. Again, hopefully it will lead to something that will benefit your journalism in the long run, and it would be great if we can keep this conversation going. My thanks again to our panelists, Sören Bauer and Benedict Wermter, and of course to you for joining us. From me, Mackie, the Thomson Foundation, and of course the team at Revolve Circular. Goodbye.